All right, let's continue with our video lectures on Rome with part number 4. All right, so we're going to take a look at Roman society, um, starting with the slave class. So, as I mentioned before, we have Rome expanding territory. We have this new supply of slaves coming in. The slave population gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The upper class, the rich, the patricians, they start getting bigger and bigger territories. All right, their farmlands get bigger and bigger, and they are, using slave labor to, for all the agricultural production. And these large farms, or nowadays we might call plantations, but back then the Romans called latifundias, right? These latifundias, right? There were these huge, huge, huge farms with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of workers, and they can produce so much crops, so much stuff that if you're like a small farmer, you can't compete because the small farmer can only work so much, and if they, have employees, they gotta pay them, while the latifundias have slaves, and you don't gotta pay for them. So what happens is that eventually the population of slaves gets so big throughout Rome, and we talk about Rome, we're not just looking at the city, we're looking at the entire, you know, territory, whether it's the republic or the empire. And they start revolting because the conditions of a Roman slave were horrific. Right? You had no rights. They would whip you. They would beat you. They would cut off fingers or arms and stuff like that. Your hands. They will abuse you, and there's nothing you can do. So it was horrible living conditions, horrible working conditions, and the slaves revolted all the time. And each time the slaves revolted, the Roman military will come in and squash it, put it down. Now, um, eventually we see bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger revolts. And the most important revolt, or the biggest one, the most famous one, was led by this guy. His name was Spartacus. And he was a slave, and he was forced to fight as a gladiator. And then he eventually breaks away from his slave master. He rises up and kills him. And he kind of like creates a slave army, and they go around town by town, killing all the Romans, killing all the slave owners, and freeing all the slaves. And the Romans are like scared out of their minds, like they're completely scared because now the slaves are getting their revenge type of thing. So the Romans had to send their army after army after army to stop Spartacus, to stop the slave rebellion, and eventually the Romans succeed, and they killed thousands of slaves, right? And women, children, old people, right? Slaves that didn't kill anyone, slaves that were forced to rebel, and the method of crucifixion was the method of execution was the crucifix, right? And then they build this long road of Roman slaves, and they're all crucified, and it goes on for miles and miles and miles. So anyone who approaches the city of Rome, the capital, will walk along this long road, this highway, this expressway of dead slaves being crucified, and it's kind of like a reminder, like don't mess with us, or else this would happen to you. So the Spartacus rebellion, violent, destructive, but it didn't change anything because after it, slavery continued, the wealth gap continued, the horrible conditions continued, and that was the end of it. All right, let's talk about Roman women. Here we see some of the more upper class type of women of Rome. Um, so Roman women, this was a patriarchal society, so they had no rights. Or I mean, they had some rights. They were never equal though, and women were not considered citizens, so they couldn't vote, so they had no suffrage. That's the term for it. The husband controlled everything. The husband was given the title of pater familia, which is the father of the family, the head of the house. And the husband decided, what business they're gonna do, what business deals they're gonna agree to, And even though women could inherit property and their wealth, and if they're widows, they can manage the business or the farm alone without a husband. The fact remains that women were never really equal, and some women, upper class women especially, were required to cover themselves, like you see here, right? And this idea of covering yourself, right, we call the veil, right, is an idea that was brought over from Mesopotamia, brought over from Persia, and it eventually makes its way into Roman society as well. And women were expected to, or some women were expected to cover themselves, especially when they're out in public and not around their family or at home. All right, so that's it for society. We'll see you next time.